I'm Sandra Levine, and I'm going to be the moderator for this very exciting panel today. I'm certainly looking forward to it. A couple of things of housekeeping. There are some surveys, evaluations on your chair. Please be sure and fill those out. It helps the folks who put the conference together to think about what to do next year and going forward. You can return them, just put them on the table at the back of the room at the end, or you can hand them to Titus, who is helping out here in the front. And before I forget, we know this is pollution payments, catalyst for transit electrification. There's a big public display right outside an electric school bus. If anybody has never been inside an electric school bus, this is your chance. They actually need to make noise so they don't sneak up on people and run over little children, which is just kind of interesting. They're so quiet. Okay, how many people rode a school bus when they were kids? Okay, a lot of us did. Remember how noisy they were? I mean, you might actually have to tone down those conversations. You can't gossip maybe so much because the bus driver and everybody else is going to be hearing what you're saying. But how cool is that? And I think it'd be great to get more electric school buses throughout Vermont and just throughout the country, and have our kids come home and say, so, I didn't burn any fossil fuels going to school today. What about you, Mom? Look forward to that. So I am an attorney with the Conservation Law Foundation, which is a New England-based environmental advocacy organization. I work on transportation, energy, climate change, wide range of those issues. But I am fortunate to have experts with me here. First is Commissioner Emily Boedecker. She is the Commissioner of Vermont's Department of Environmental Conservation. And before joining state government, she was the Executive Director of Local Motion, statewide advocate for biking, walking, and sustainable transportation. So she certainly knows a lot about transportation as well as a lot about environmental conservation. And prior to working at Local Motion, she worked for the Vermont chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And then next up we have Ingrid Malmgren. She's a transportation policy manager at Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. Her background is in energy policy, including energy efficiency programs, regulation, and strategic electrification. She's recently worked with the National Association of State Energy Offices and developing a toolkit for states to use in deciding how to use their funds for the Volkswagen Environmental Mitigation Trust. More information about all the speakers in the program are online. And I'm very sad to say that Daniel Gaddy from Union of Concerned Scientists could not be joining us today. So this panel is about pollution payments and how we can use those as a catalyst for transportation electrification. So how do we use pollution payments to get more electric buses, more electric school buses, more electric cars onto the road? And I'm going to start with saying that the notion that polluters pay is not something new. We see it every day with things like water pollution. They have to pay to clean it up. Issue in Vermont, sadly, we're seeing it now with the problems in Bennington with the pollution from PFOA. They're paying to help clean up and provide clean water for folks. Also for cleaning up hazardous waste sites. Also for fees like when you buy a tire, you're paying a fee to recycle that tire or dispose of that tire. That's, in broad terms, what a pollution fee is and how it can be used to transform and support the results of the effects of that pollution. One large example we have, and I think the focus of what we're going to talk about here today is really the Volkswagen settlement. But as folks may well know, Volkswagen, they were selling cars that didn't comply with air quality regulations. As a result of that, many states, including Vermont, now have money available to use to address the impacts of the increased pollution from the Volkswagen cars. Volkswagen may not be alone. There may also be similar proceedings or settlements coming forward, I think from Fiat, maybe also from Jeep. So this sadly may not be something new, but it's good to figure out now how we're going to be using the money from the Volkswagen settlement and going forward how we're going to make sure we get the biggest bang for the buck and use that money wisely. So Commissioner Boedecker will provide some background because she's really immersed in the trust for Vermont and how we're going to manage the Volkswagen settlement funds and tell us where Vermont is. And then Ms. Malmgren will talk a little bit about opportunities for electrification of transportation and how that addresses many of the policy goals set forward in the VW settlement. So, Ms. Boedecker.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. And I say rather than environmental conservation, my department really should be called Air, Water, Land and Waste, which is really what we do. And I joke that my sister departments, they've got fish and wildlife, you know what fish and wildlife look like, and they've got forest parks and recreation, you know what they look like. They're also huggable. Trees are huggable, bears are huggable. So my department really is at the core of keeping our lands and our waters and our air clean for everybody. Couple of things that Sandy just mentioned about the principle of polluter pays. In many situations, that pollutant and the result of it, the evidence is right there in front of you. We can think about Bennington and PFOA, and there where we hold to the principle of polluter pays, we're getting to the point where we're going to be able to put in water mains and POETs and other long-term solutions. Where we've got a situation with our water pollutants, excess phosphorus and nitrogen, we're seeing some chronic cyanobacteria blooms that again is right in front of you showing what the issues are. So when you have a large, highly respected company like Volkswagen and they're polluting, it's not necessarily visible. So there's a little bit of a plug here for the need for EPA and regulators and standards, because that's in fact how we discovered that this cheating software, and you've heard various different media terms for what it is, had actually resulted in the diesel cars, as they were being tested for their emissions, able to perform at a standard that would pass our stringent air emission standards. But when they were actually in use, the emissions could have been up to 40 times more. So many of you know about this area. You know that diesel emissions are a class 1 carcinogen. We've got hydrocarbons, we've got carbon monoxide, we've got particulate matter. So we've got a lot of different issues with carbon emissions. But we don't really see what that is. Vermont's had an air quality program that is monitoring and permitting various different emission-producing industries for a number of years. And we work very hard and diligently to keep Vermont's air quality of a good standard. We are in attainment for the ambient air quality standards. But this is something we don't actually talk about much. We have a handful of days in certain locations in Vermont each year where we have an ozone exceedance. So you take the NOx emissions, you take carbon monoxide, you mix it with volatile organic compounds. In sunlight, we get ground level ozone from diesel emissions. So the opportunity with the VW settlement that will be final with the courts either today or tomorrow, I forget if it's the 2nd or 3rd, is a moment in time we've been waiting for a while. And we'll just go through a little bit of the history. So the overall settlement is $2.7 billion. The US, unlike Europe and other parts of the world, had not invested quite so heavily in what was considered at that time to be clean diesel technologies for passenger cars. And so our settlement is maybe less than others, but we did have 500,000 vehicles that were part of this settlement. And so the result is $2.7 billion and $18.7 million coming to Vermont. That sounds like a really huge amount of money, $18.7 billion. Well, now we've got to think about what do we do with that? What are the most important things? What are the goals we need to achieve in Vermont? What are all the various different policies that we have? And how do we spend this money in the wisest way possible? So just very quickly, we can get our hands on a third of the money off the bat. We have 10 years to spend this money. And one of the things that we were waiting to hear from the trust and its settlement is how can we spend this money? And that's actually pretty flexible. It can come to the state. It can come to a third party. It can go direct to a project applicant. It can go direct to a provider of the equipment that the applicant is buying. It can be as a reimbursement. It can be an advance up front. So we've got a lot of flexibility with how these funds flow. What we've got to determine is in pursuit of what goal. So just very quickly, just so we're all clear about where NOx emissions come from, and this will speak to the eligible mitigation actions. So as you can see, there's a number of sources of NOx emissions in Vermont. That top left for you, on-road light-duty vehicles gas, not included. So that's an area of NOx emissions that we need to address through other things, like the vehicle inspection program. You can see on-road heavy-duty vehicles, non-road equipment, locomotives, and even some commercial marine vessels. I think we have maybe 3 that fall in that category in Vermont. These are all eligible categories. There are some others there that I'm not going to go into in too much detail. So this can help us look at about 50% of the sources of NOx emissions in Vermont. One of the steps, I'll go through the timeline a little later on, is that we are going to submit as Vermont a beneficiary mitigation plan. This is really the first step in responding to the trust and saying this is how we will actually spend those funds. It's relatively broad in terms of a plan. It sets the sideboards to make sure that we are meeting all of the legal requirements in the trust, and actually has these 4 different areas. And I'll talk about the first 2 in a little bit more detail today. In there, we have to state overall goal, 18.7 million. How are we going to spend this? What do we want to achieve? It looks at the eligible mitigation activities. There's a list of 10 different ones. Are we interested in all of them? Do we want to identify 2 or 3 that are a priority? How will we take care of areas that have a disproportionate share of the air pollution burden? And sometimes a word that's used here that gets a little confusing is the communities that have a disproportionate burden. We don't necessarily have communities that are designated in non-attainment. Apparently Ohio came out with a plan early on. They said, hey, we're going to put all these funds into our non-attainment areas. And everybody who wasn't a non-attainment area said, hang on, how much money are you getting? It shouldn't just go there. So lots of considerations about how we consider where we have a disproportionate share of the air pollution burden. And that tends to be where you have a lot of buses, where you have a lot of trucks. And so it might be a particular area within a community as opposed to a community. How do we take that into consideration? And also the plan requires us to have a look at the expected range of emissions benefits. The overall purpose of this trust is to mitigate for the NOx emissions that were caused by the VW cheating software, as it's so called. So we have a lot of things we would love to do with this money. 18.7 million is not enough. I will be delighted if in the future we have Fiat and Jeep and everybody else coming in. We can't plan on it. So how are we going to use 18.7? So there's really 3 things, 3 top goals, there could be many, that we want to achieve. We want to reduce NOx emissions from mobile sources, and we want to do that in the most cost-effective way possible. We want to make sure that we demonstrate market viability of all electric vehicles, the lion that's sitting down there at the entrance here. And we want to make sure that we maximize public and private investment in electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So with those goals in mind, we're starting to look at the eligible mitigation actions. And I'll just spend a little bit of time on here because what I really want to talk about is the process. How do you align this amount of funds with those goals? What's the actual process for identifying and seeking out applications for an RFP? And how do we track what we're doing? How do we make sure that we are evolving to whatever the projects are that are coming up in Vermont? So just very quickly, the light-duty electric vehicle supply equipment. There is a maximum within here, legal sideboards, of 15% to be spent on electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Governor Scott is very interested in this opportunity. He's very interested in both it as an economic opportunity. Also, he's looking at all those Canadians driving their electric cars, everybody in Boston and New York wanting to come up. I really want to make sure that Vermont lives up to its reputation and is a destination where you can come in your electric vehicle. Having just taken advantage of Green Mountain Power's incentive and bought myself a Leaf, I'm very keenly and personally interested in where those charging stations might go in. Also, some of our heaviest NOx emissions today come from our freight trucks. So you don't get to spend this money on a long-haul truck that's going across multiple states. We get to spend this on a variety of short-haul trucks within the state. And think about everything from your cement mixer, your town's dump truck, your beverage delivery vehicle, and a lot of the smaller trucks that we see on the road today. People always think truck, pickup truck. I know a number of you in the room know that that's a light duty vehicle, so that's not eligible. And also buses, both transit buses and school buses. And both of these, I think, also speak to rectifying situations where there is a higher degree of the impact. If you look at the downtown transit center in Burlington, the number of buses coming in and out of there every day, there's an obvious concentration of diesel fumes today. You know, when you drop your kids off at school, maybe you walk to school, maybe you bike to school, still talking about that old world, then you've got a lot of buses coming into one place. And even though they're only supposed to idle for no more than 5 minutes, we've got a concentration there. So how do we also take that into consideration? Locomotive freight switches, forklifts, marine vehicles, also part of the eligible categories. And so that's something that we need to consider if there are projects in Vermont that would like to go forward in this. And then I also want to make a mention of DERA. So DERA was established in 2005. It's a federally funded program from the EPA. Obviously depends on how much the feds put in the bucket and what share we get. But each year, Vermont has got between about 70,000 and about 235,000 in this bucket. At times, we have difficulty spending these funds. Some of the sideboards on the DERA program are even a little bit more strict than they are with the VW monies. They have some of the same considerations. If you're repowering a vehicle, obviously the outside, the chassis remains the same, you're repowering. If you're replacing, you're required to drill a hole in the engine block and cut the chassis. So what you're actually doing is making sure that your dirtier diesel engines are taken off the market. But as somebody, as a business who's saying, hey, I'm interested in changing out one of my diesel-powered vehicles earlier, normally if you buy a new vehicle, you sell the old one. So where we have some cost shares in the region of 25%, even though we can give you a grant to incent your change out, you might actually come out about the same as if you were selling that old vehicle. One of the things we're really hoping with the VW trust funds is that awareness has grown substantially about this opportunity. And we're really looking to our advocacy partners as well to help spread the word about this and to work with potential applicants to make sure that we have projects coming in for these funds. So DERA is up here because you can actually match DERA funds, your allocation from the feds, with monies from the VW Trust. And if you match one-to-one, the EPA has a little extra monies that they'll throw into the pot. So that's also something for us to consider. So I just want to mention a couple of things. I'd mentioned scrappage. As you probably know, the cost share amounts are different. If you're government, we can cost share up to 100%. If you are non-government private, but it's an all-electric vehicle, we can cost share up to 75%. If you're replacing or repowering with diesel, the percentages are somewhere of 25 to 40%. So here's yet another dial. When we're looking at how do we issue an RFP, how do we score and rank projects, yet another dial to consider. What are our overall goals? Is it health in all policies? Is it addressing NOx reduction? Is it making sure that we can move towards renewable fuels, renewable energy, and meet some of the standards and goals that Vermont has laid out? How do we make sure that we use this money in the best way possible? Could you actually replace a bus if you got 8% of cost share rather than 100%? These are all details that are going to really take a lot of us working together to figure out and making sure that we spend these funds in the most effective way possible. I'll just mention here, I had a rather fun conversation with some friends who were over for dinner a few nights ago, and actually it was the 12-year-old son of these friends. And he saw that I had some papers out, and one was about electric school buses. He was like, cool, can we get one? And so I said, well, here's some of the details. As we've got 18.7 million. Wow, that's so much money. So then I said, well, here's your approximate cost of an electric bus with all of the charging infrastructure we need, 350,000 approximately. For a clean diesel bus, it's about 100,000. So we could buy 150 clean diesel buses, or we could buy 39 electric buses. Now that's just kind of a rough comparison. The amount is going to be a little different in both areas, and we're not going to simply put all monies into one area or another. But I was saying to him, well, how should we figure out who gets the buses? And he said, I've got an idea. I've got the answer for you. It's like, great, I've been looking for the answer. So the answer was that the school who have the winning cross-country run team get electric school buses. So just want to let you know that we've got that solved. We don't need to worry about it anymore. But it was also fun because there was the excitement of somebody who rides a bus and somebody who's aware of environmental issues. You know, they're our friends. You know how you kind of hang out with your like. But also recognizing, and I love the perplexion on their faces, like 18.7 million, lots of money, competing goals, how we do this. There was one other thought, and he actually went online, pulled up Tesla, and said, look, for 135,000, did the math, here's how many Tesla cars. I think we should have all of our police sheriffs in Tesla cars. So, knowing that we need to go a little deeper than that, let's talk about the timeline. So actually this first one, trust effective date, awaiting notification, is today or tomorrow. It's right now, which is fabulous. It's today? Okay, good. I couldn't remember. I thought it was on the day I was here, but I thought I was here Tuesday. So I just had to check that. So next thing is that Vermont files a beneficiary certification letter. So the Scott administration has decided the Agency of Natural Resources will be the recipient, and it will be the Department of Environmental Conservation. So basically what that means is we get the work to coordinate with our other departments. And obviously, you can imagine there's great interest from VTrans, the Agency of Commerce and Development, the Public Service Department, the Department of Health, about how these funds are spent. The Agency of Commerce and Transportation have already been working on plans and studies to look at where we can make the most effective investment in charging infrastructure in Vermont. So we'll be organizing both the conversation with the agencies so that we can hear all of their input. We've had a website up for a few months now seeking input from the general public. We're also having conversations with friends in the advocacy community. We're also reaching out to some of the fleet managers. So we'll want to bring together different groups of people so we can make sure that we all have a common understanding of the legal framework. We have a common understanding of what a fleet manager's constraints are. And we need to look at things like, let's go back to the school bus example. So there are some other constraints in this. We can only repower, replace, or change out models that are 2009 or older. So if you've got a school district who's already changing out their buses, they have models 2010, 11, 12, they're not eligible. If you actually contract out, for example, to First Student, and they actually own the buses, they're eligible up to 75% of cost share, but not 100%. So there's a lot of different levers that we need to look at and a lot of different dials to turn so we can maximize how we actually get this money on the ground. So once we are actually designated as the beneficiary, then we'll actually start work on the RFP and looking at the project selection criteria so we can see how we fine-tune that. There's a couple of really interesting things going on here. We're obviously not the only state. And on the one hand, we want to get money on the ground really fast, because if we've only got a certain number of model years that are eligible, and as we are seeing these buses age and get changed out, maybe if they're older and they're going to get changed out anyway, we want to let them happen. But what if you're maybe like a 2005, 2006 model? So on the one hand, we want to get money out there as quickly as we can. On the other hand, can you imagine what $2.7 billion is going to do to the technology available today? And so we're seeing a number of companies start to look at whether or not they can increase their manufacturing. They're looking at repower of different buses. So maybe if we spend our money 3 years from now or 4 years from now, we could get a better technology. We could get a more proven solution. So again, another dial that we need to think of. So I do want to make it clear that the agency is seeking input right now on the website. And although there was nothing that was specified in the trust, not only are we having conversations with various interested parties, and please let me know if we should be having advanced conversations, we're also going to be, hopefully just in a few short weeks, putting out the beneficiary mitigation plan, which again will outline the sideboards. It doesn't necessarily go into all the details we want to see about the RFP and scoring criteria. We're going to be putting that out for official public comment. We're going to be having what is standard for the Department of Environmental Conservation, a 30-day public comment period. We're going to be taking those comments in, doing a written response, and continuing to work and refine on the RFP and the project scoring criteria. And the important thing to note here is we need to make sure that this process remains flexible and evolutionary. Do we put out a narrow RFP first and try and grab some of those models, those school bus models, those truck models, before they're no longer eligible? Do we do it really broad and see what kind of categories of project come in and then fine-tune to direct funds to the goals that we want to achieve over time? And how do we build in the new technologies that are coming out to make sure that we achieve the best goals for Vermonters? So lots of very interesting questions. Glad to have you all on the journey with us. And I will turn it over now to Ingrid.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Commissioner Boedecker. So, as Sandy mentioned, I'm from Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, and I'm here to continue the conversation about the VW settlement. They've asked me to speak here today mainly because I worked with the National Association of State Energy Officers, and we put together a toolkit based on the mitigation settlement for Volkswagen to help provide information it provides an introduction to the settlement, timeline, requirements for states, details about the 10 eligible mitigation actions, introduction to available technologies, information about tools that can be used to calculate NOx reduction from vehicle replacements, information about the cost share requirements, and examples of case studies of vehicle replacements for newer diesel and alternative technologies. So if you're interested in reading all you could ever want to know, you can just Google VW and NASEO, N-A-S-E-O, and it'll pop right up. So the goals of this settlement, as Commissioner Boedecker mentioned, are to reduce NOx emissions and to target mitigation actions to air quality in areas that bear a disproportionate share of air pollution burden. But I would like to go a step further and assert that if we focus on electrification of vehicles, as we can within the 10 eligible mitigation actions, we can advance Vermont's goals and help transform markets in Vermont. So by spending the maximum allowable amount on zero-emission vehicle infrastructure and focusing fund use on the electrification of heavy-duty vehicles, we can also meet these goals. So quick survey, did anyone arrive here at the conference in a hybrid vehicle? Okay, anybody in a plug-in hybrid? Anybody in an all-electric vehicle? Okay, so these technologies are out on the road and they exist and they're in use now, and for anybody who has them, you can see that they work. We also, as we've mentioned, as we've talked about, there's an electric school bus parked right outside. I've ridden on the school bus at a conference up in Montreal, and aside from the fact that it's quieter, smoother operating, there's not like the jerkiness of the gears, and obviously emissions free, so much less stinky. It was very much like a regular school bus. So here's some of the technologies that are all electric. They've made a lot of progress. Some of these are very nascent technologies, some of the real heavy duty stuff. But school buses and electric transit buses are two technologies that have been tried and true, especially electric transit buses have been operating for years. So quick, first and foremost, we should absolutely maximize the amount of funding we can use for EV charging. This is a status by state of what states are planning to do with their VW settlement funds regarding the allowance of allocating up to 15% of the funds for EV charging. So in Vermont, we'll be receiving $18.69 million approximately, and that means up to $2.8 million of that money can be used for charging infrastructure. So rather than replacing old diesel vehicles with new diesel vehicles or other fossil fuel vehicles, I'm really advocating that Vermont should use a large portion of this funding toward electrification, and here's why. If VW funding goes to replace an existing old diesel truck with a new diesel truck, they can last for 30 years or more. So that means 30 years of purchasing diesel fuels and all the price volatility that comes with it, 30 years of diesel emissions, which cause health and environmental externalities that Vermonters are going to pay for through taxes, and higher maintenance costs than electric vehicles. So here's 8 reasons that I think Vermont should invest their VW settlement funds in vehicle electrification. 1, Vermont greenhouse gas emissions goals. In 2005, the Vermont legislature set a goal for Vermont greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So the gray star is where we were supposed to be in 2012. The yellow line, that's where we really were. The red star, that's where we're supposed to be in 2028, which is about 10 years away. So I would argue that there's no way that we're going to be able to meet these goals unless we electrify transportation. Transportation is the largest contributor to NOx emissions in the state of Vermont. It's also the largest source of carbon dioxide emissions, as you can see from this graph. Heavy-duty vehicles are responsible for contributing a disproportionate amount of emissions due to their large size, heavy cargo, and high mileage. Electrification of heavy-duty vehicles will help us meet Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions goal. Reason number 2, keep money in Vermont's economy. 80% of the cost of a gallon of diesel immediately leaves the local economy. As more renewable and distributed energy generation comes online in Vermont, that means that for electric transportation, more money stays here at home. In 2014, Vermont spent approximately $1.38 billion on petroleum fuels. Over $1 billion of this left the state. Reason number 3, improved health. As Commissioner Boedecker mentioned, NOx is linked, NOx combined with volatile organic compounds and other chemicals creates ozone, which is linked to asthma, respiratory system irritation, allergy sensitivity, respiratory infections, and premature death. Diesel exhaust also contains other pollutants that pose health risks. Diesel exhaust is classified as a Group 1 carcinogen by the World Health Organization, meaning that exposure to diesel exhaust is linked with lung cancer in humans. Diesel exhaust also causes early death, heart attacks, strokes, congestive heart failure. It exacerbates asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and may cause developmental and reproductive harm. Children are especially susceptible to diesel pollution, to the impacts. According to the Vermont Department of Health, 1 in 12 children in Vermont now have asthma. Reason number 4, clean electricity in the Northeast. Vermont's electricity is among the cleanest in the nation and is continually becoming cleaner. In the first part of this millennium, carbon dioxide emission rates from the electric sector decreased by 39% in New York and 28% in New England. Robust clean energy policies in the Northeast states, such as renewable portfolio standards, greenhouse gas emissions targets, and participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, support continued greenhouse gas emissions reduction. Cleaner electricity means greater benefits from electric transportation. Reason number 5, let's improve Vermont's electric grid. The batteries in heavy-duty vehicles can help balance out electricity generation and electric load. When the grid has excess generation, vehicles can charge their batteries and prevent transmission constraints. This stored energy can later be used for zero-emission transportation. Eventually, vehicles could deliver electricity back into the grid when demand is high with bidirectional charging. By charging during times of high generation and using that energy during times of high demand, electric vehicles can really help improve grid efficiency and reliability. If utilities reduce EV charging rates during times of excess generation, typically at night when most vehicles are parked and can be charging, operation costs for electric transportation can become even more affordable. Both electricity prices and marginal emissions increase as utility loads approach peak use periods. Flattening electric load using EVs creates more efficient use of grid assets, thus lowering the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity. Reason number 6, which is very appropriate for this conference, is electric vehicles or transportation electrification can help us integrate renewables into the grid, which is one of the goals in the CEP, is having renewable transportation. Several areas of Vermont are experiencing transmission or distribution constraints from renewable generation. Transferring excess generation into vehicle batteries can help maximize the value of EVs and allow renewable generators to run at full capacity, thus increasing their efficiency and cost effectiveness. Imagine a fleet of electric school buses operating in northern Vermont. Excess wind generation can power those buses at night and provide children in the area with clean, healthy, efficient transportation during the day. Reason number 7, improving equity. As Commissioner Boedecker mentioned, one of the requirements of this VW settlement is that states must describe how their mitigation actions impact those disproportionately impacted by the pollution. For some states, this will be determined through non-attainment areas. Vermont is somewhat limited in its non-attainment areas, and so one way to accommodate this requirement is to identify vulnerable communities through the examination of air quality and microenvironments, such as in congested areas that have public transportation and diesel transit buses. An additional way to meet this criteria is to identify populations most vulnerable to negative health impacts from emissions, such as low-income populations, children, and the elderly. And targeting mitigation actions to help reduce NOx exposure by those populations is another way to address this requirement. And I learned today from a cost effectiveness perspective and reaching low-income populations at an earlier session from the Northwest Regional Planning Commission. They mentioned that most of their region's transportation costs exceed 15% of their household income. Thanks for that information. Reason number 8, fuel security benefits. So another reason to electrify transportation is that it has the potential to greatly reduce the impact of gasoline and oil dependence on U.S. national security and fuel security. So the U.S. is, not surprisingly, the world's largest petroleum consumer. It consumed about 19 million barrels per day of petroleum products in 2015. Nearly 3/4 of this went to the transportation sector. That equates to roughly $570 million spent per day on petroleum for transportation in 2015. The U.S. demand for oil is so high that significant disruption to the U.S. economy can occur from oil price and supply volatility, not to mention the costs of military operations necessary to secure this energy source. So in conclusion, there are proven electric transportation options for many heavy-duty vehicles, particularly school buses and transit buses, that could be implemented right here in Vermont. Certainly go down and check out the electric school bus that's here today. The market for electric vehicles, heavy-duty electric vehicles, is small. It's nascent. The most promising ones are school buses and transit buses as far as how far along they are in being used on a regular basis and on the road today. The VW settlement offers a unique opportunity to buy down the upfront purchase price of these vehicles, which is their main barrier to being used today. In fact, the way the settlement is designed, electric vehicles require lower cost share than the other technologies. So using these funds toward EV infrastructure and heavy-duty electric vehicles has the potential to bring multiple benefits to Vermont and Vermonters. It's an opportunity we don't want to miss. Thanks.
So thank you all for coming. We ran over just a little bit, so I think our panelists will be up here in the front if you've got other questions. I don't want to keep you. I think we're standing between you and lunch, which is always a bad place to be. So thank you all. Thanks again. A big round of applause.